My primary research field is political philosophy rather than philosophy of medicine or medical humanities. So what I would like to offer will be from this department. And the title of my talk is The Politics of the Thyroid, Reclaiming One's Metabolism. What this title actually means is the topic that has emerged for me for two reasons. One of them is a personal reason, and that is my experience of post-surgical hypothyroidism. And the other is at the opposite end of the spectrum, and it's related to my broader research in which I aim to rethink politics in the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is not what I want to talk about today, but as far as I define this broader research framework for myself, one of the many points that it includes is the task of rethinking the free agency of human beings as embodied. And this is what I would like to talk about today. I want to show what I mean by the free agency of human beings being embodied and suggest a model of politics that it can imply. In order to do so, I want to use the thyroid as a starting point and a concluding point. The thyroid is an endocrine gland which plays a crucial role in the body's organ metabolism, in that it ensures the absorption of substances, the intake of oxygen, and generally influences the overall growth of the organism. And I always think about the thyroid as the organ that keeps things together for the body and gets the body going. And in this sense, we could say that, well, a properly functioning thyroid, or more generally, the proper performance of thyroid functions is crucial to the body's agency, if agency is understood very generally as the body's ability to achieve and maintain its proper development. By saying that I want to think about human agency as embodied, I want to treat this bodily sense of agency as crucial to what human agency is in general. And in a way, I want to think about human agency through the prism of the thyroid, arguing that, well, obviously, it's not that we perform agency despite having bodies, but nor are our bodies merely vehicles through which we exercise agency, but rather we are agents as bodies, and due to the ways in which we are organized as bodies, which crucially includes a properly functioning thyroid. As such, my topic is general and potentially addresses all kinds of human bodies and the agency of all kinds of human bodies, but I want to give special place to female embodiment and treat it as exemplary for my argument. The special relevance of female embodiment could be justified in connection to the thyroid as well, and that is for two reasons. The first one is that, well, although the thyroid is gender neutral in that all kinds of human bodies require a properly functioning thyroid, there's a well-documented discrepancy in the incidence of thyroid diseases and dysfunctions to women's or to female bodies' disadvantage. And among the many factors that are being cited as possibly contributing to this imbalance are the progesterone and estrogen levels in female bodies, which, if true, would suggest that there might be something about the ways in which female bodies are organized that can interfere with the functioning of the thyroid and therefore with the embodied agency of female bodies. So a more general lesson from that point would be that when we want to think about human agency as embodied, we need to acknowledge that it is based on the factors over which we do not have agency, that it is the result of a complex network of interacting, but also potentially interfering factors. I think this was covered in one of the papers before about menstrual cycles and how it can impact agency. So that's one point. And the other point that could be in fact broken down into two sub-points, so to speak, is the research that there suggests that there might be an association between some contraceptive pills for women and some thyroid dysfunctions. And if this is true, then, well, these sources of thyroid dysfunctions are what we would call biopolitical, related to the forms of administering female bodies. And more generally, when we want to think about human agency as embodied, we need to acknowledge this bio and necropolitical interference with, but also potentially constructive contribution to human embodiment and human agency. But one more thing that I would like to add here is that when women choose to use contraception, I would argue that, well, they exercise what could be called free agency, in that they choose to intervene in the spontaneous patterns of the functioning of their bodies. And more generally, by free agency, I mean this ability to intervene in the existing patterns in which reality is organized, including materiality. But I want to argue that, well, we can exercise free agency again as bodies. One last point that I want to mention just very briefly regarding the thyroid is that obviously a properly functioning thyroid requires the proper level of iodine in the environment, which opens up the question of the relationship between the human and the non-human and links to the problem of the Anthropocene, but I want to leave it on the side for today and follow to the details of my argument and start with this exemplary character of female embodiment. By way of introduction, I would like to very briefly refer to Iris Marion Young's classic analysis of female embodiment from the paper Throwing It Like a Girl, which has been discussed in greater detail today in the other panel. But yeah, very generally, Young argues that, well, female experience of embodiment is characterized by the tension between immanence, that is the perception of being locked up in one's body and being determined by the body, and on the other hand, between the transcendence, that is the ability to use this body to perform agency, to go beyond bodily limitations. I would like to argue that, in fact, this tension is characteristic for the free embodied agency of human beings in general, albeit admittedly different kinds of human bodies can experience it in different ways. And my hypothesis is that, in fact, the tension between immanence and transcendence could be construed as actually generating the sense of freedom. And in order to begin to justify this hypothesis, I want to link the tension mentioned by Young to an ambivalence that can be found in the work of an author that probably wouldn't be the first one we'd go to when thinking about embodiment and female embodiment. That is Hannah Arendt, who uses a peculiar phrase, that which is as it is, which doesn't seem very technical, but I would argue it is quite philosophically robust. And as far as I am aware, it appears in two different contexts. The first one is when Arendt talks about thaumazein, that is wonder, which she understands in this Greek Socratic / Platonic way as the pathos that overcomes us when we are confronted with that which is as it is. Something very general that is simply out there, strikes us and makes us realize that there will always be something more to what we will ever be able to express through words. That which is as it is, as its cause, to what Young calls transcendence, because, well, thaumazein makes us realize that we do not have to stay locked up in a specific way of thinking. But it is a transcendence of an ambivalent kind, because it is also upsetting. It unsettles us, makes us go speechless, lose our bearings, etc. So that's one context. And the other context in which the phrase appears is when Arendt discusses what she believes are the aspects of her identity that she thought were simply given, not made, that were, as she calls it, physei, not nomoi. So here the phrase that which is as it is refers to what Arendt believes defines her as an immanence, to certain determinants, certain limitations that are simply out there for her to accept. So we can see an ambivalence here again. On the one hand, we have limitations, but Arendt speaks about gratitude for them, or a more general term could be acknowledgement of them. And among such physei, as Arendt says, she included her Jewish identity, but also quite interestingly her sex / gender, her femininity. The latter point could obviously be interpreted very conservatively, maybe even transphobically, but I think another interpretation is possible. And this is an interpretation that stems from this coincidence that I am aiming to show with this slide, namely from the fact that Arendt used the very same phrase, that which is as it is, to talk about what she believed determines us as an immanence, and to talk about what she believes takes us beyond a specific place. And I also think it is quite meaningful that she used her body as an example of immanence, because my suggestion is that it is because we are bodies that we experience this ambivalence of that which is as it is. And to justify this suggestion, I'm going back to authors that will deal with female embodiment in more obvious ways than Arendt. And again, very briefly, I would like to discuss the work of the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective, a group of feminists active in the 1970s and 1980s, whose major book, Sexual Difference, A Theory of Social Symbol Practice, could be read as the project aiming to develop that which is as it is of female embodiment into the principle of freedom. So the Milanese started from what they believed was a factual assumption, the fact that women function as political beings as certain bodies due to the bodies that they have. And rather than transcend this fact, they wanted to develop this fact into the principle of transcendence, so to speak, or the principle of freedom. as they did so, they didn't want to obliterate female differences, but rather wanted to allow for the diversity for the diverse ways of being a woman or a female, of being a female body. And what is interesting is that they found this plurality of female experiences liberating, and the revelation came when they started making aesthetic judgments about literature, when they started discussing their favorite female authors. So at this point, three questions could be asked. Well, first, why should the experience of plurality be liberating? Second, why should this transformation occur during the process of making aesthetic judgment? And finally, what do bodies have to do with this process? Some answers to these questions could be found in the book by Linda Cerulli, Feminism and the Abyss of Freedom, because Cerulli goes to the Milanese, points to the practice of judgment discovered and celebrated by the Milanese, and argues that this practice of judgment offers a good blueprint for the feminist understanding and practice of freedom. And what Cerulli finds attractive in the practice of judgment of the Milanese is first that the practice was relational, meaning that the women, that the Milanese expressed their differences to each other, they making themselves vulnerable to each other's judgments and judging each other. And secondly, Cerulli suggests that the differences that they're expressed in the process were irreducible to the general characteristics of their positions, such as, well, sexuality, class, education, etc. Which I think I would agree with it, because, well, although it's obvious that our social milieu can greatly impact our aesthetic judgment, our aesthetic preferences, it also seems quite credible to me that to the extent that the term aesthetic preference is supposed to retain any sense, it cannot fully lose its individual, if not idiosyncratic character. And this last point, this idiosyncrasy of aesthetic preferences, is linked to one more feature of aesthetic judgments that I think Cerulli does not address, namely that there does seem to be something compelling about aesthetic judgments. Our aesthetic preferences determine how we choose things, but we do not choose the preferences themselves. We would say that, well, I cannot but like this song, this movie, etc. And this sort of commanding character of aesthetic preferences is, I think, covered in the approach that inspired Cerulli's interpretation of judgment. And that is, again, an approach offered by Hannah Arendt. Arendt, on her part, drew on Immanuel Kant's model of reflective judgment of taste to argue that this model offers a good blueprint for political judgment. And in the process, she reworked the principle of enlarged mentality, on the basis of which reflective judgments were supposed to operate, according to Kant. Arendt defines enlarged mentality as being and thinking in one's own identity where actually one is not, which is an interesting formulation because I would argue it combines these two senses of that which is as it is that I have mentioned, and or in other words, it combines the moment of transcendence with the moment of immanence. So Arendt suggests that when we make a reflective judgment, we have to, in a way, reach out to the differences of others, open ourselves up to the transcendence of that which is as it is of their positions, so to speak. But at the same time, we cannot, and probably even should not, fully leave the position where we are. So we are supposed to, in a way, express that which is as it is of our own position by referring to that which is as it is of other positions. And if this process of judgment, as Cerulli argues, and so does Arendt, is supposed to result in the experience of freedom, then it would appear that this is the experience of freedom that stems from the act of, well, expressing one's own unchosen difference by relating to, in the process of relating to the differences of others. I would like to link this feature of reflective judgment to one more feature of the approach that Cerulli does not discuss and Arendt mentioned only very briefly, namely that, well, in the original formulation, it was supposed to be judgment of taste. This is Kant's original phrase, which Arendt took over. And obviously it was conventional, but it is possible, and Arendt hinted on this interpretation, that it's quite remarkable that this specific sensual faculty designates reflective judgment. And I think it's possible and quite interesting to take this sensual dimension seriously. Such interpretation has been offered recently, for example, by a Swedish author, Cecilia Schuholm. And on this reading, reflective judgment, judgment of taste, is something that we do as bodies that choose how they want to relate to other bodies, which kind of relationships they want to take in, so to speak, and which we want to reject. But obviously, judgment of taste is still a reflective judgment, which means that, well, it is a relational practice. And this in turn means that when I make a judgment of taste, I open myself up not only just to some inert factors, but to the opinions of others. Reflective judgment. It is this relating to others, speaking from one's own embodied position by choosing the relationships with other bodies that we want to conclude. It is in this process that we are supposed to, well, experience freedom. So whatever these judgments, reflective judgments may be specifically about, they are always fundamentally a way of expressing and experiencing, or maybe experiencing and expressing free embodied agency. To show what this could actually mean and to show the kind of politics that this interpretation, this embodied interpretation of reflective judgment may imply, I would like to conclude by, well, introducing one more author, that is Judith Butler, and her book, Notes Towards a Performative Theory of an Assembly, where Butler creatively engages with Arendt's model of politics. In the fragment that I am showing right now on screen, Butler does not mention judgment. Instead, she speaks about Arendt's concept of appearance, but I would argue that judgment is the key faculty through which appearance happens for Arendt. So judgment is the faculty through which we appear to others, and the way through which we take the appearances of others in. So whatever Butler says here, I think could be applied to judgment as well. And what Butler does say is that we appear to each other through judgment as bodies. But by virtue of being a body, we are always in a specific place, and at the same time, our body, while defining the place that we occupy, is also what presents us to others, what, as Butler says, displaces us. So here, the suggestion is that, well, it is the body that combines these two senses of that which is as it is. The body is both something that defines us as an immanence, and that, well, makes us, results in the fact that we transcend the immanence that we are. So, for example, well, a properly functioning thyroid is crucial to my embodied agency, but, well, the thyroid is something that I do not fully control because it can act up out of its own accord or due to some political interventions or whatever. So it already introduces an element of strangeness, of something uncontrollable into what I am. And, well, as this specific body with a thyroid dysfunction, I can make a judgment, engage in a reflective judgment from this specific embodied position that I occupy, and turn myself to others who are out there to receive my judgment. And these others, who, as Butler says elsewhere in the book and in a slightly different context, are in a way the company that I do not choose. They are there. I am supposed to take them into account when I make my judgment, and they respond to my judgment. For example, providing me with some medical assistance that I require to function properly given the dysfunction of my thyroid. And in this sense, these others are an unchosen condition of freedom, as Butler says. But I would say that this phrase, an unchosen condition of freedom, could also be applied to not only to those others, but also to whatever is unchosen about my own body. So in this process of making a reflective judgment from my own embodied position, I, in a way, take into account the differences of others. And while this acknowledgement of difference, in a way, reflects back on my own position and helps me embrace the body that I am, and not just a source of vulnerability, but also as the core of my agency, on behalf of which I make claims, demanding whatever I need to become this embodied agent that I am. So very generally, what I mean by the politics of the thyroid is both the project of, well, taking into account all the political factors that can influence the thyroid functioning, but also I mean by that the project of rethinking thyroid, so to speak. And by the same token, what I mean by reclaiming one's agency, I mean obviously the ability to, well, have as much control over one's agency and one's metabolism as it is possible. But I also understand reclaiming as rearticulating. That is, rearticulating metabolism as crucial to political agency, to the free agency of human beings. Okay, so here I'm showing the resources that I have used, and well, that is just by way of concluding. Thank you for your attention.